Hello, and welcome to the Homegrown Fuel Podcast, sharing stories of ethanol's emergence in rural America. I'm your host, Sue Retka Schill, a biofuels journalist now retired from full-time work, but still writing about ethanol and other biofuels for Ethanol Producer Magazine and others. There are so many good stories out there about the early days of the ethanol movement that ought to be recorded. Writing a book takes a lot of time and resources, but I love talking to people, and people love telling their story. So the idea for this podcast was born. Thanks to BBI International and Ethanol Producer Magazine for producing this podcast. My guest today is Shirley Ball, who calls herself an ethanolic. I've heard she makes a mean DDG's cookie. Shirley, welcome to the Homegrown Fuel Podcast. How did you get your start in ethanol, or I guess it was called gasohol back in that day?
It was gasohol when I got involved. Yes, I'm a farmer in northeastern Montana. I've been a farmer all my life, born and raised, and my husband and I. And in the 70s, things were pretty tough for agriculture. We were not getting a fair price for our crop. And it seemed like the government policies, they didn't seem to understand agriculture at all. And a farm women's organization was developed, women involved in farm economics. And I went to meetings and I learned about their goal to push for ethanol fuel. Actually, they called it gasohol. And I pondered on it, studied it a bit, and it seemed to have a lot of good answers and solutions for agriculture. You know, you can complain a lot about what's going on, but if you don't have solutions, what are you going to have? The solution would be that you could take that grain that you were not getting a very good price for and turn it into fuel, which had a very high price. And not only that, at that point, it was being embargoed. If you remember when gas and fuel was rationed. So that kind of drove me to learn a little bit more about it. And that, as I said, was in the 70s.
Wow. So you became wife's, was it your fuel
energy chairman?
Representative? Energy chairman. Yeah. Okay. What kind of things did you do as energy chairman for wife? You testified in Washington, D.C. or made many trips?
Well, no. A number of times that I testified, but we developed our policy. And actually, the first thing that they did was have a convoy to bring attention. It seems to me that you can't get any attention for your issues unless you're in Washington, D.C. or New York or something like that. Out in the country, we can talk about it all we want, but we needed support from the public. We needed support from politicians. And so there was a convoy of vehicles. I helped to organize it, although I didn't go on that. And it's a long ways from Montana to Washington, and they arranged for publicity all along the way and brought the attention to the congressman that we needed to have a change in policies and that ethanol could be part of that change. After that, there was all of the negative, of course, naysayers. Well, you can't take food and turn it into fuel. People are going to starve. Well, that's not so. You are only taking the starch out of the grain and turning that into the fuel. And so we set about showing the public and proving to the public that that was so. And then we actually had a little still. We didn't need to have this, but it's really good for visual. A little still with a coil on top of it. And it actually has the coil that went out in the reflux column and so on. And then we took the distiller's grains, and those distiller's grains, I had them tested in a laboratory, and they proved to be very, very high protein, 30-some% depending on what your beginning product was. But the stuff that I did the first time was about 34% protein. Well, where are you going to get 34% protein in anything? And this was good wheat. It was wheat that could be edible wheat. It was not feed grain. And so we used the distiller's grains then as and recipes. We developed, in fact, we had a recipe contest and at our local fair and developed that distiller's grains into a number of foods. And okay, hey, that made sense to a lot of people. And so we started to show that around our community at many meetings and at fairs and so on, showing how that process works, how the and of course people stop because who wants that kettle that's sitting there on a table? And then we're offering free food. And there was a lot of the recipes that were, just tasty candy, cookies or banana bread type things. And so people would stop and you could tell the story. And uh, one of the ladies, I mean, there was a group of us, and one of the ladies was telling the story at a fair, and Congressman Marlene, Ron Marlene, now he was from northeastern Montana, and he was on the Ag Committee in the House and in the Congress. And he said, you should bring that to Washington, D.C., and we'll show it to my colleagues. Huh, huh, big time, huh? So we thought, well, yeah, you can't turn down an invitation like that. And of course, we had to find the money to pay for such a trip, and we did that. And there was 4 of us that went, and we went with the still and the coil and the cookies and the banana bread and all those things, and we went to Washington, D.C. Well, visualize just a little bit of that still with the coil. Nowadays, on planes, we would never have gotten it on board, but we did get it on board, and getting it in through the security as you're going into some of the buildings in Washington, D.C. That was an interesting thing too. But we were able to talk our way through it, and then we put on the presentation, and we were in the House Ag Committee, and went through and told about how, okay, you only are taking the starch away from this grain. And we had kernels of grain there that would show what we were talking about. And we had a bottle of the mash. And then again, a little bottle of alcohol. And so we could show the whole process and talk about the whole process. And then we'd have the distillers grains. And finally, we'd have the cookies and the snacks that we had prepared. And we put that on 3 times when we were in the House Ag Committee. One of the times, Deputy Secretary Ling, they did not have a Secretary of Agriculture yet. They had, but the Deputy Secretary was Ling, if I remember his name right. I know it's that. And okay, anyhow, he came and was very interested in what we were doing. Well, we also took it to the interreligious task force that day. And then again, we went over to the Senate where Senator Baucus and Senator Melcher hosted us in the Ag Committee room over there to do the same presentation. We got so much publicity. I heard back from all over the United States from people that wrote, remember, this was before the internet. You couldn't go Google ethanol and find out anything about it. You couldn't just click on a question on your computer and get an answer. And so I got scads and scads of mail from throughout the United States asking, how do you do this? And what is this about ethanol? And they wanted to know more about it. And so I sent information to lots of people. We kept on doing that presentation for a very long time. In fact, it probably still is going on someplace. I don't know. So
Well, yeah, you called it the food and fuel presentation, and did you said you had met with Rosalind Carter, but was that before the food and fuel presentation went on?
yeah, that was a previous trip to Washington, D.C. But that was when the fuel embargo was at the heaviest,
Okay.
and we were afraid that we were not going to have fuel for our harvest. And we tried to get in with Jimmy Carter, but instead we got to go meet with Rosalind, and then she had a staff member that came and met with us, and he was and talked about it. And I think, and they must have been on something at that point in order to make sure that farmers did have the fuel that they could have for their harvest. But do you remember the long lines of people waiting to get fuel? Drivers of
Yeah,
all sorts were impacted.
yeah, that's where a lot of the energy security talk came from, was that concern about having enough fuel. Um, And that was a big part of the motivation. But on the ag side, it was both that need for fuel and the low prices that you were talking about earlier.
Right, right. Well, the low prices was the big driver because if you're spending more than you're bringing in, you're eating into your equity and you're not going to live long. You're not going to keep your business going. And farming is a business. I know people, especially at that time, didn't tend to think about farmers as businessmen, but businessmen they were, and so were the wives. The wives were the women that kept the books, and they also did some of the field work, and they also did. I mean, they were full partners, so they knew what was going on, and they felt that they could carry the story, and that's why wife was it probably came into being.
Mike Bryan said you guys wore red hats.
The color of wife was red because our books were in the red. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. The farm books were in the red. And so that was our color. Well, not only that, we had quite a slogan when we began, and it was "Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned." Um, and that was only there for a little while before some of the saner heads said, that's probably not very ladylike, and we do want to be ladylike. So we took away the "Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned," but I still like it.
Yeah. Well, you were the only woman on a major USDA panel. Was that in the 80s that you were on that panel?
Yeah. Yeah, that was 10 years later. I'd done a lot of presentations by that time and been involved in many other things. And yes, in 1987, politics plays a big role. And Jimmy Carter was good for ethanol. But, when Ronald Reagan came into office, he took away all of the, alternative fuel things that there were, and which is too bad because the things were growing, but it was pretty quiet then for a few years. And then his vice president, George Bush, decided to run for president. And then there was a interest in, hey, what was that alternative fuel you guys have been talking about? And so they decided that there should be a study, and it was Senator Dole initiated the study, as I remember it. And it was a study to study the cost effectiveness of ethanol. And as we reviewed and studied all of the information that we had, we came out with a positive study. We could put it on paper and prove it. And so it was kind of interesting. There were people that came and listened to this once in a while, but not too many. But one day we had a big audience, and we were in Cincinnati, and there was a gentleman there from the oil industry. And he said, "Oh, yeah, but the subsidies for ethanol," he said, that's major problem, and whatever he said. But and I said to him, I asked him, "Well, have the oil companies ever gotten any subsidies?" And he looked me in the eye and he said, "Oh, no, not that I can think of." Well, of course, by that time, we had already had a whole chapter in our book that told about the subsidies that that the oil industry gets and continues to get, even to this day. The oil people have got it pretty good. It's probably not money out of your pocket directly, but it is there.
Yeah, it is. Well, that report then led to another bunch of invitations to go all over to talk about what you learned.
Yeah, yes, it did. And I ended up going many places to speak to people and providing information, sending information out. And it got expensive because you have to copy things and you have to look it up. And again, if only the internet had been going at that time. But of course, that wasn't so. And so I did share a lot of information. And I spoke in North Dakota, and I went to Pennsylvania and various places, and spoke to people and sent out a lot of information by mail. Yeah, and so people were getting acquainted and aware of what was going on. So I, yeah, it grew. It grew a lot. And after a number of months of this, I and others decided that we needed to maybe form an organization that would provide information. And because working under the auspices of wife, I was, there wife had a lot of other things to do besides just the energy. They had, all the commodities had to be uh, talked about and worked on, and so I decided that we needed a new organization, and a number of other people agreed with me, and we got together and we organized EPAC, Ethanol Producers and Consumers, and that was in about 1990. And then with that organization, we published a newsletter, we put on conferences, we worked with the Department of Energy and put on workshops throughout the United States. We went to North Carolina and to Pennsylvania and to North Dakota and many places to put on conferences and help people understand more about ethanol and ethanol fuel and the distillers grains. I always made sure there was always someone that was talking about the distillers grains, because to me that was a very important part of the whole ethanol industry. The distillers grains, it was is as important, in fact, in the alcohol could be the co-product or the side product, but because the distillers grains are very, very high in nutrition, and they develop easily into recipes. They can be used as an extender in meatloaf if you wanted to do it that way, or we had them in cookies. We put them in candies. We put them in distillers grain cereals. So it was it would be
Cool.
a good food product as well.
Yeah.
And the ethanol. Go ahead.
Did you use corn distillers grains, or was that wheat distillers grains?
It was wheat distillers grains. There was a small wheat ethanol plant in Montana. Gordon Doig was the owner, him and his brother, and they were in Ringling, Montana, and they had the best distillers grains. It was a beautiful product. It was tasty. Now, Canada does a lot of wheat distillers grains, where corn, of course, is more common in the United States. So, but the wheat distillers, I tried corn and a couple of recipes, and it would work in some things. But then if you think about it, when you cook with wheat flour. You don't cook much with cornmeal, but the recipes where you do use cornmeal can use the corn distillers grains. So you could develop it that way, but the wheat worked out very, very well. I guess that I still use a little bit of it once in a while. So
Cool.
the distillers grains came from various places, but there was a really good place in Canada that had wheat distillers grains, and that was a good tasting and good appearing product. So we did use from that too. So we did try different places, different times.
So EPAC had one of the first flex fuel vehicles, didn't it?
Yes, indeed. That was kind of interesting. It was one of the first ones manufactured. Our board of directors for EPAC, one of the guys said, we should be showing how it performs. And we were able to get a car. We got a grant, and we were able to rent a flexible fueled vehicle. And we had a Ford Taurus, was the first one. In order to get that, we had to go through. I had been going to many meetings, and in the Clean Cities, I'd met people from the Department of Energy, and I'd met a lot of vehicle. Ford usually had a representative there. Chevy had a representative at Clean City meetings. Were you acquainted with the Clean City meetings?
Yeah, I've heard about them. Yeah,
Yeah,
they did a lot of work on cleaning up air pollution in cities, and really became a big supporter of ethanol blends.
A very big supporter of ethanol blends and others. They also cleaned up parks like Yellowstone Park. That was one of the Clean City places too. But I had learned to know a lot of people. And so in order to get the car, I kind of drew on that and was able to find a car in California. And it was supposed to be in California, not in Montana, but we were able to get it. And someone went to California and drove it back to Montana. And that was our first ethanol car. And we decorated those cars so that they had, the sponsors' names were on there, of course. But then we had big signs on them, ethanol powered. Anyhow, it was attention getting, and of course that was the purpose for it. And then we had to make arrangements to show the car. We were lucky to get support from the Department of Energy and a number of other places. A number of businesses, ethanol businesses, liked the idea of showing off the car, and that car would run on 85% ethanol and 15% gas. Now, where do you get 85% ethanol, 15% gas? At our house, it was at our farm because we just got it. We were able to get a tank of ethanol from Cenex and had that. And then we blended our own. So, the blending was probably not done exactly, but the car ran perfectly all the time and it ran all over. Okay, as part of our project then with the car, we were going to have to show that car around our first grant from the Department of Energy, and this would be the Department of Energy out of the Seattle office. And they said, well, we want you to go to all of the states that are represented in our area. And the states included Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Alaska, and Hawaii. He said, except for Hawaii, kind of hard to drive to Hawaii. But they would, that was part of the conditions of the grant. And we thought, well, that's doable. And so we set out. And of course, that was again before the internet. So you had to find places to display that car. There was no one saying, well, there's a meeting going on in such and such. We had to search and find places. And so we went to, first of all, we went to Nevada. That was there was an energy meeting being held there, and we had the car on display at a Clean Cities. No, it wasn't Clean Cities. It was.
Was that the Western Petroleum Marketers?
Not yet.
Or was that another meeting?
Yet. That
Not
was
yet.
a different.
Okay.
It was something to do with the Department of Energy. Can't remember. Oh, anyhow, and then we went to Spokane, Washington, for a Cenex convention that was going on, or Farmers Union convention, one or the other. And then we went to Idaho for a farmers kind of a forum. And we were in Oregon at Portland. And that again was a Department of Energy meeting that was being held there. And then from there, we got in the car. I mean, this wasn't from one to the other. It was go to that and go home to Nashville, Montana, and restock, or whatever you call it. And then we'd go to the, it was arranged over it was over a couple of years' time. So It wasn't one right after the other. Anyhow, but this one was from Portland. We headed north to Alaska. And so we drove, my husband and my daughter helped to drive because the fair up there was starting, and we got out of the meeting that we were at in Portland, and we headed north and got the car up to the fair, and then we put in the fair, and it was there for 10 days. And that was very interesting to have the Alaska people come by and talk about ethanol. And surprisingly, there was a lot of interest about ethanol in Alaska. You think of it as an oil state, but there was a lot of interest about the ethanol.
So there was a meeting that trip to Alaska had to have been crazy to drive from Portland to Alaska in a couple of days. But you talked too about another meeting that you had with the Western Petroleum Marketers, and in the first time around, somebody was pretty skeptical about where these ethanol guys come from. What was that story like?
Okay, one of our board members was associated with the oil industry, and he said, they are our customers. Ethanol is being sold to the oil companies. We need to take our product to them and tell them about it. And so we got a space at the Western Petroleum Marketers Association. It was meeting in Las Vegas. And we had all sorts of sponsorship to do that because booth space there is very, very expensive. I think we paid $1,600 a booth, and there was a need for 2 booths in order to put a car in there. And then, of course, just traveling there and all of the information you're going to give out and all of it takes money. But the the ethanol industry was very supportive of that, and the Department of Energy helped with that, and there was another group that helped with it. It was the Montana Wheat and Barley was even good about helping with it. So we had support so that we could afford to go do it. And we had a car in the trade show, and these are huge trade shows, great big. They're held at the Mirage in Las Vegas, or there's a couple of hotels that have the big display area, and so, and of course, the big wigs from the oil industry have to walk around and look at things, before it actually gets opened. And they walked by and they said, "Who in the hell let the ethanol people in here?" I don't know if that can be corrected or not.
But then later on, they got to liking you. I mean, you said there were marketers that didn't know that they could how ethanol performed in engines.
A lot of the mom and pop people that have service stations come to those meetings to learn about, marketing and about their fuel and so on. And they have all sorts of workshops, but nobody told them that ethanol fuel would add the octane. Not all of them. I'm sure a lot of them knew it, but some of them didn't. And then there was the fact that ethanol, if you put fuel into your car in the wintertime in a place like Montana or North Dakota or whatever in the northern states, it prevents the gas line freeze up. If you have any water at all, the ethanol would take care of it. And they hadn't known about that. There was other things that we were able to tell them about the fuel. And anyhow, I guess that maybe we won them over because about the third year that they said, "Well, you guys want to put on a workshop for us?" And so EPAC is we put some people together and put on a workshop. And there was quite a few people that came. So, another one that was very supportive of our display there would have been Ford Motor Company. They were super because we had, of course, Ford Motor. We had a Taurus sitting there on display, but they were very good about this helping with the sponsorship and things like that. So, yeah, okay, and we did that we had a booth down there for over 20 years, and it might still be going after as I graduated out of things finally. Well, I think that other groups stepped in and they still take ethanol cars and have them there. And I don't know if that is to this day because I haven't checked just recently, but I know it continued for a while after I was no longer able to do it. But I did it for about, I don't remember now, maybe 10, 12 years that we drove to, and you have to remember where I live. I live in northeastern Montana, and, it's not just like driving, our first 300 mile is all 2-lane, and in the wintertime, and it was always in February. So, so it went on for a number of years and it was a good deal, but it got the message to a different group of people than you're going to see at the farm meetings and the, so it was a good thing to do. I look back on it and think that was one of the good things that happened. And I think that it helped to bring the industry along. I fueled up the car this morning when I was out, and I noticed on the pump, this pump might contain 10% ethanol. And I thought, boy, I helped to get that sign there. And because, it was proud. I don't know if you remember when the gasohol, as it first came out, they wouldn't put it under the banner. For instance, if a major oil company had a station, and the owner, an individual, wanted to try the ethanol, they couldn't put it under their banner. They had to put it off to the side of their lot. They just weren't going to allow ethanol in market. It took a lot to get the ethanol into the market.
Do you remember some of the hearings or the testifying you did? Are there any ones that stand out particularly of going to Washington and and testifying in those 80s and 90s?
We testified MTBE was being considered as the fuel under the, I'll have to think about that for a minute, but it was going to be
under the Clean Air
they
Act.
had to have an
it?
oxygen. Yeah, they had to have an oxygenated fuel because there was so much pollution in the air. Yeah, there was anyhow. Yeah, you're reminding me. Anyhow, and MTBE is a product of the oil company, and that's what they were pushing. And MTBE is an oxygenate, but it still isn't clean as the ethanol was. And so I testified there, and I don't know. I wish I should have had it marked. It brought good response from a lot of people, that especially that agriculture was supporting it that way. That it use ethanol as the oxygenate of choice rather than to use MTBE.
Right. So right. Well, and you talked about that convoy that wife organized, and then was it about 10 years later you organized another one?
Yep. Yes, in 1987. Yes. Of course, they were still the naysayers. And that was before, of course, that was still back with WIFE, Women Involved in Farm Economics. And there was all the naysayers about the ethanol yet. And oh my golly, you can't put ethanol in the fuel. It's people are going to, well, for Denver and Missoula and what was it, about 19 communities in the United States that were under some kind of they were needed to clean up their emissions. They had such a heavy pollution, and Denver was one of the main ones. And I don't know if you ever knew Barbara Charnes. She was pushing for ethanol rather than MTBE as the oxygenate of choice, so that the emissions would be cleaner. And so we decided that we should show the people of Denver why, the benefits of the ethanol. And so we organized a convoy of vehicles to come from throughout the United States into Denver, where we had a big conference. There was cars coming from New Mexico and Texas and Washington State and Montana, Wyoming. I'm trying to think of others that how much further away they were. And they went into Denver, and we had publicity. We had huge publicity. As we left our home states, we all tried to have a press conference. And on the way, we stopped in any town that was, because people would be coming from multiple directions, and we'd stop and try to do press. And it's about a 12-hour drive probably from where I am. But people from Washington State, you add another 12 onto that or more. And anyhow, we had good press on that. And that was running on 10% ethanol. We had CB radios, so we talked to the truckers as they went by, or to the communities as we drove through them. And and that was, and anyhow, showed that us farm women could drive into Denver running on ethanol fuel, and there would not be any problem. Your car is not going to stall like they had expected it was going to do. So yes, that was fun. And then we held a conference afterwards, and again we got very good publicity. There was good when the TV cameras will show up and show the cars. And the cars are well decorated, some of them really well decorated. So it was kind of an interesting, fun thing to do. Yeah, it was kind of a reminiscent of the convoy that had been held in 77. But that time they had gone to Washington, D.C., and on that convoy, however, they had to carry their ethanol with them in a tank in the back of a pickup. And the lady that had the pickup and the big barrel in the back of her pickup, she had to be bonded to take that ethanol, and then they would splash blend. Do you remember the term splash?
Yes.
Splash blend. Well, they'd put in some ethanol and they'd put in the gas and shake the car, and that was their splash blending on that trip. Now we were luckier in 87. We could get ethanol blended fuel a few places, and we had scouted around, so we knew where we could go to get it, so that we could run on ethanol blended fuel without having to have a tank of ethanol with us. So it's been a fun. It turned into a really interesting thing in my life to be able to promote
and
the
it sounds
fuel.
like you had to do a huge amount of fundraising and grant
Yes.
writing to keep the
Yep.
EPAC going and to
Yep.
cover all these meetings. You must have become a
Yep.
pretty good grant writer over the years.
I guess I did. I did go to a class, and grant writing, a lot of times you have to know who you're writing for. And I had a good reputation with the Department of Energy. I had a good reputation with the car dealerships that we got funding from. So and then you have to write. They have things that they want to happen too, and that's why they give you the money so that they don't have to do them, and you can do them. They wanted to promote the ethanol. They didn't have the staff or the people, and so it worked out really well for me.
Great.
My board of directors, I was the main person working in the office, but we had a couple of other people that were really good. I need to mention my friends Linda and Patsy, because Linda Nielsen and Patsy Remke, none of this could have happened without them. They were the ones that really they worked at it, but they didn't want the job. They didn't want to write the grants, but they wouldn't mind helping with the projects. And so, and my husband was so good about helping until he passed away. He was very supportive of it. We had tried. A number of families had tried to build an ethanol plant in Montana, and we done all the research, and we had all of the paperwork, and we had an agreement with the Department of Energy. And that's when Ronald Reagan came into office, and he rescinded our grant as well as a number of others. And so we still believed it was the right thing to do. But, I mean, for those 4 years, nothing much happened until George Bush decided to run for vice president. But, I mean, we gave up our plans, but it didn't mean that we gave up our thoughts that ethanol would be a success for fuel and would be providing, if there's another market for our grain, we're going to get a better price.
Yeah.
So
well,
that was
being a
the
wheat
basic.
farmers, I'm amazed that being a wheat farmer, you were that supportive. Because the ethanol became a corn ethanol thing. But did wheat farmers see some benefits from corn ethanol as well?
Well, when the RFS passed, oh yes, wheat farmers, the price went up for wheat as well as it did for corn. Yeah, the grains followed. It followed. I noticed when the RFS passed, after that, farmers upgraded their machinery because they were getting a better price. They could afford to upgrade their machinery. Our machinery dealers in our little town, both of them did some improving on their businesses. It maybe added another, whatever it was, another stall to the garages or whatever, or to the shops, whatever it was. And so, yes, it did make a difference. And I asked one of the machinery dealers, and I said, I noticed it's nice to have the new building. Did that happen because of the RFS? And he said, well, actually, that was the thing that pushed it. So when there was a requirement for the fuel, it did push the price up. Yeah, for wheat as well as for corn. Yeah, I'm in northeastern Montana. Well, there's no corn, and there might be some corn on the cob in a few gardens, but there's no corn that's commercially but there is some in southern Montana, but not to the quantity that you would need to have for an ethanol plant. It's a smaller. We had sugar beets, but sugar beets somehow did never seem to work out. And it should have, but it never worked out to that was a major crop for ethanol production.
Okay. So do you have, of all the years, I mean, you were involved from the 70s until well into what, 2010, 2015, somewhere like that, when you finally retired. Do you have a favorite memory?
A favorite memory. Oh, there's so many favorites. the people became a favorite. There were so many. Um, we called ourselves the Old Fogies Group. Yeah, let's go to the memory of Bill Homburg. Bill Homburg, he was oh he was a veteran. He'd been in the service, and he was working in Washington D.C. With the Department of Energy. Um, and he was so helpful when we went to Washington D.C. for things. He was just a very I don't know. He helped to get us into the White House. We took cookies to uh, the White House a number of times, and that would have been because of Bill Homburg opening the door for us. Bill worked with the Information Resources at one time. I mean, not worked for, but associated with them would probably be a better word. And there was some really active people there. There was just some really nice people there. And then the White House was kind of a fun thing. We met with Boyden Gray. Do you know the name? Boyden Gray.
I've heard the
He
name,
worked
yeah.
He worked for George Bush. I don't know if he's an attorney. I'm sure he was an attorney. And he worked for George Bush in the White House. And so every time we went to Washington, and we went to Washington fairly often, crazy women that we were, that's a 3-plane trip. It's not like just getting in the car and going someplace. It's a 3-plane trip to get to Washington, D.C. from where I live. And but we'd go to testify or go to make a presentation or go because someone had an interest in what we were doing. And so we'd make an appointment to go to the White House every time that we could. And one time we were in the White House, we had just gotten in, we'd taken our tray of cookies, and I'm sure it's the cookies that got us in the door always. And we'd taken our tray of cookies and we sat down. I suppose we were there to maybe lobby for a specific thing, legislation. Anyhow, and he got a phone call. And he said, "Oh, I'm sorry, ladies. I've got something I've got to take care of. I'm sorry, you're going to have to go." And so we left the cookies and gathered up our purses and walked out. And when we got on the street, there was Jesse Jackson. And Jesse was protesting. He was leading a parade of a bunch of people. And we found out later that that's when the riots were going on and in California. Do you remember? Yeah. And we figured that must have been what he had to attend to. We didn't know. But anyhow, we went back later. When Bill Homburg, I started out with him, when Bill Homburg passed away, that would have been in 17, I believe it was, I decided I was going to go to the funeral. It was going to be held at Arlington Cemetery. He was really big on Arlington. When we were in Washington, a lot of times he would take us out there for lunch, and there was a fueling station close to Arlington that sold the ethanol blend. So anyhow, his funeral was going to be there. So I decided I was going to go. And then I asked my grandson and some of my great grandkids if they'd like to see Washington, D.C. If I was going to go, they may as well go along, And so they did. Anyhow, we all went to the funeral. And that is a favorite memory. And so many of my favorite ethanol people were there. Max and Grazia Schock. Did you know Max Schock? With
No.
the pilot with the plane the stunt plane.
Oh, yes. I've seen pictures of that stunt plane. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And they were at the funeral. In fact, I was in a lot of display events with them through the years. Wonderful people. And then I think Todd was there. I think Todd Sneller was there. I'm trying to think of there was a bunch of ethanol people. But anyhow, Boyden came into the church and he sat right in front of me. And so I introduced myself and said, "Well, I used to come to your office." And he said, "Oh, I remember you." And, that was kind of oh, okay.
That is kind of fun.
He was such a nice gentleman. Yeah, it was this big shot. And you remember this little Montana farm girl, So I think it was
the cookies. Yeah, it was the cookies. Well, that's what I heard about working when I first started at BBI and worked for Ethanol Producer Magazine was Shirley Ball and those DDG's cookies. So they were infamous. Thank you so much, Shirley, for spending some time with us today and sharing some of your stories. And I hope people learn to appreciate the amount of work that went into that decades of the 80s and the 90s, just trying to get the message out there.
Yep.
Thank you for your contribution, Shirley. Thank you much.
Well, I thank you very much. And it's really been fun to kind of reminisce and talk about it. So I hope that this works out. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to Ethanol Producer Magazine for sponsoring this episode of the Homegrown Fuels podcast. Ethanol Producer Magazine is the #1 source for ethanol industry news, trends, and statistics. Through the print magazine and website, ethanolproducer.com, the editorial team delivers daily news and industry features to an audience of producers, service providers, and vendors. If you would like to sponsor a future episode of Homegrown Fuels, contact service@bbiinternational.com. And if you have a comment on an episode or know of a story that ought to be shared, email homegrownfuels@bbiinternational.com. This podcast was recorded and edited by Danielle Pekarsky, Content Manager at BBI International, and I'm your host, Sue Retka Schill. Thank you for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another episode of Homegrown Fuels, sharing stories of ethanol's emergence in rural America.